The gavel nearly split the air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sentence. A final, cracking judgment on 6 children who had already lost everything. They stood in a line like cattle, their wrists marked with numbers hastily written in chalk. The courthouse clerk who wrote them didn't dare meet their eyes. 6 children. 3 girls, 3 boys. The oldest was 12, the youngest only 4. All of them were covered in the same layer of travel dust and grief that no amount of water could ever wash away. The smallest girl, June, clutched the side of her sister's dress so tightly her knuckles went white. Her sister Charlotte, who was barely 10, stood rigid. She refused to cry. She'd cried the whole ride from the homestead to Greer's Crossing. She'd screamed herself hoarse the day the deputy pried their baby brother from their dead mother's arms. She had no more tears to give. Besides, tears made them look weak, and weak children she knew got picked last, or not at all. Charlotte had already heard a woman in the crowd say it plainly, as if the children weren't even there. "That one looks too sour to be raised," the woman had sneered. "Bet she bites." So Charlotte kept her jaw shut like an iron trap. This wasn't a proper auction house. It was just a dusty stage outside the sheriff's office, propped up with crates. A swinging sign still read, "Notice hanging at sundown," left over from 2 days prior. But today the spectacle was quieter and somehow crueler. People gathered in 2s and 3s, mostly women without children of their own, or old men who looked like they needed someone to do the heavy lifting around their farms. Pastor Elkins watched from his porch across the street, his hands folded, his lips moving in silent prayer. Or maybe he was just counting. The marshal called out the first name. Clara Bell, 7 years old, good health, strong arms, already knows how to churn butter and wring laundry. Starting bid, $5. It was done without shame. The townsfolk had seen worse. This was their legal solution to a tragic fire that had wiped out an entire family and half their neighbors in the valley. If no one stepped in, the children would be sent to different counties, different homes, or worse. "5!" a woman called from the side, her voice sharp and confident. "6!" another countered. The bidding climbed, not with enthusiasm, but with cold practicality. No one cheered, no one clapped. Clara was sold for $8 and handed off to a woman with a crooked bun and a burlap sack, ready to carry her new acquisition. Clara didn't cry. She just turned back once. Once. Looking for her siblings. Charlotte didn't wave. She didn't want to give the girl false hope. Didn't want her to believe she'd ever see them again. The marshal called the next name. Mason Bell, age 10. That was her twin. He didn't step forward right away, so the deputy gave him a rough push. Mason stumbled, but he kept his chin up, his eyes fixed on some distant point nobody else could see. The bidding was slower this time. He was quiet, a bit thin for his age. One man in a wide-brimmed hat offered $4, then scoffed when no one challenged him. The gavel came down again. 2 gone. June whimpered beside her. "June Bell, age 4. The marshal called next, and Charlotte's heart leapt against her ribs like a cornered animal. "No!" she shouted, stepping forward, her arms thrown out. "She don't eat much. Take me first." The crowd rustled. The deputy started toward her, his hand already on his holster. But before he could reach her, a voice cut clean through the air. A voice so calm and final, it silenced the entire town. $20. Everyone turned. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Or if he had, no one had noticed him. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a long, dusty coat, like he'd ridden in hard and hadn't bothered to brush off the trail. His voice was low, without urgency, but it carried a weight that made the air itself seem to stop moving. The marshal blinked, confused. "Sir, we're on the girl here." "I'm buying all of them," the stranger said. Silence snapped across the crowd like a dry twig breaking. People stared, their mouths agape. Half were scandalized, the other half were relieved. "All 6, the stranger repeated, his voice unchanged. "Whatever the total comes to. I'll pay it in gold if I have to. The deputy stepped forward, puffing out his chest. We don't do bulk sales, mister. These kids are orphans, the stranger interrupted, his eyes like chips of flint. With no kin, no ties, and no defense. You said it yourself. You want them gone from your books. I want them whole. Let's not waste any more breath on it. The town buzzed with whispers. That's the man from Birch Hollow, someone muttered. The one with no wife. No, he's from Dead Man's Run. I seen him once near Widow's Bluff. He ain't from anywhere, another argued. Look at that coat. That's cavalry stitching. Confederate, maybe. Charlotte didn't care who he was. She only cared that the marshal's hand was hovering in the air, the gavel ready, his eyes darting between the stranger and the children. He was working through an equation he didn't quite trust. You'll take them all? The marshal asked finally, his voice weak. Yes. You got a name for reference? An address? Name's Whit Garner, the man said, stepping up onto the wooden platform like he owned it. As for where I live, wherever they do, starting today. The gavel fell, and just like that, they weren't for sale anymore. But that wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. Because even as Whit Garner handed over a pouch of gold coins that seemed far too light to carry that much wealth, two men stood near the far side of the crowd. They hadn't been bidding. They hadn't been moving. They were just watching. One wore a tan coat with a marshal's star on his breast pocket, though it didn't belong to this county. The other wore fine leather gloves despite the heat, and his lip was curled in a permanent sneer, like someone who smelled something rotten on the wind. When Whit turned to gather the children, the gloved man muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for his partner to hear. He's lying, the man whispered. Those kids ain't strangers to him, not a single one of them. Neither of the two men moved as Whit led the children toward the inn on the far end of town. He asked for 2 rooms, one for the girls, one for the boys, and laid down more gold than the innkeeper had seen in a full year. The innkeeper's eyes went wide, and he didn't ask a single question. That night, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, June fell asleep in Charlotte's arms without crying. But Charlotte couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing. Mason wouldn't say a word. He just sat by the window, a silent statue watching the moon climb the sky. The other 2 brothers, Eli and Samuel, quiet and sunburnt from a life spent outdoors, stayed close to each other, as if they were afraid that even now, hope was a trap. Whit didn't speak much. He kept to himself, leaving early in the morning to speak with the county judge. By the time he returned in the afternoon, the papers were signed. The county had officially turned over guardianship. There was no going back. They belonged to him now. But something in the back of Charlotte's mind itched. A detail that didn't fit. He knew their names, all of them. He knew them before the marshal ever called them out. He had said all 6, not all the children. He never once asked which ones were which. He just gathered them up as if he were collecting his own property. And then there was the coughing. Late in the night, June had started coughing, a dry, dusty hack from her raw throat. Without a word, Whit had reached into his long coat pocket and pulled out a small, dented tin of lemon lozenges, her favorite kind, the kind their mother used to keep in her apron drawer, the exact same brand, the exact same tin, with a familiar little dent on the lid where it had been dropped one too many times. Charlotte hadn't said a word about it, but she didn't sleep a wink that night. She just watched the strange man who had bought them, the man who knew too much. The following morning broke quiet and gray, with clouds stretched low across the hills like a grim warning. Charlotte stood at the window of their room, her arms crossed tight, her eyes locked on the horse tethered outside the inn. It hadn't moved all night. Neither had she. She hadn't really spoken to Whit Garner since he'd bought them, not beyond a stiff thank you, or a quick protective glance when June leaned too far from the curb. But now, as she watched him speaking to a woman in a black bonnet near the general store, something in her gut twisted again. It was the same cold ache she'd felt when their mother had whispered, "Run." just seconds before the fire burst through the back window of their cabin. An instinct, a warning bell ringing deep inside her. Something about this man didn't line up. Mason was still asleep, a rare moment of peace for him. Eli and Samuel sat quietly at the foot of their bed, playing a silent game with pebbles they'd found in the yard. June was gone. The realization hit Charlotte like a slap to the face. She spun away from the window, her eyes scanning the room. June wasn't there. She didn't scream, not yet. She saved her screams for when they mattered. She dashed from the room, her boots slipping on the old wooden planks of the stairs. The innkeeper shouted something about not running, but his voice was a distant buzz. She burst into the lobby and froze. June was sitting at a small table across from Whit Garner. Her little legs dangled off the chair, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of what smelled like chamomile tea. Whit wasn't looking at her. He was sharpening a small knife, a slow, methodical motion, the kind of action a man does without thinking. When he noticed Charlotte's shadow in the doorway, he looked up, and for the first time since she'd met him, a faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. "She woke up early," he said, his voice gentle. "Couldn't sleep. Figured she could use something warm." Charlotte didn't move. Her heart was hammering so loud it made her ears ring. Her eyes were locked on the knife. "She's not supposed to go anywhere without telling me," she said, her voice tight. "She didn't," he replied calmly. "She came downstairs. I was already here." Whit tucked the knife back into its leather sheath, as if sensing her fear. Charlotte walked over, her gaze never leaving him. "She could have gotten lost. She didn't," he said again. "I'm her sister," Charlotte snapped. "I know." The way he said it, so quiet, so steady, made something under Charlotte's skin crawl. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. She picked up June without another word and carried her back upstairs, the little girl's warm cup left steaming on the table. By the end of the day, they were packed and ready to leave. Whit didn't tell them where they were going, only that the town had done its part, and their welcome was wearing thin. He'd arranged for a covered wagon, big enough to hold all of them and their few belongings. Charlotte had 1,000 questions, but she asked none of them. Not yet. She watched. She memorized. The way he walked, the way he knew too much, the way he touched the back of Mason's head, a fleeting, paternal gesture, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. She didn't trust him, not fully, not yet. They left Greer's Crossing just before sundown, the wagon wheels creaking a lonely rhythm on the dusty road. The ride stretched into dusk, then into full darkness. Whit rode up front, alone, the reins in one hand, his other hand resting on something hidden under his coat. A weapon, Charlotte guessed. She sat in the back, a blanket over her legs, clutching a small scrap of paper she'd managed to snatch from the inn's ledger when the keeper wasn't looking. It listed his name, Whit Garner, but had no home address, no past entries. Just a name, appearing out of nowhere. They stopped near midnight. A cabin stood in the woods just off Dunwick Pass. It was old and listing slightly to one side, but it looked clean enough. Whit walked to the door and unlocked it with a key that was already in his coat. That's when Mason finally spoke. His voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "You've been here before." Whit turned, his face unreadable in the moonlight. "This place," Mason continued, his voice sure. "You knew where the key was." Whit's reply came after a long, heavy beat. "I built it, years ago, before the war." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the children. "I figured someday, someone might need it." No one said anything else. The children filed into the cabin, the air thick with the smell of old pine and cold ash. The hearth was still full of soot from a fire long dead. Whit lit a new one, the flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. He brought out provisions from his saddlebags, dried meat, a jar of jam, hard bread. He laid them out without ceremony and didn't touch a single bite until all the children had eaten their fill. Later that night, after the others had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Charlotte found the tin again. Whit had left his coat slung over a chair near the fire, the same tin of lemon lozenges, the same dent in the lid. A dent June had made herself, dropping it on the hearthstone of their old cabin a year ago. Their mother had carried that tin every single day for 3 years. It was impossible, a coincidence too sharp, too specific to be real. She decided she had to know. She moved like a fox testing the edge of a trap. Whit lay on the floor by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. He seemed to be asleep, but she noticed his breathing never slowed all the way. It was the shallow breath of a man who was only pretending to rest. She waited until she heard a soft, deliberate snore, a sound just for her benefit. Then she slipped her hand beneath the coat flung over the chair. Her fingers closed around 3 items she didn't expect. A folded photograph, a heavy gold locket, and a letter, sealed with wax, addressed to someone named E.B. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the photograph. It was old, cracked along the edges. It showed a younger Whit, handsome and proud in a soldier's uniform, standing next to a woman. The woman was holding a baby. And the woman was unmistakably Charlotte's mother. Her heart stopped. The baby in the photo wasn't June. It wasn't any of them. It was a child she'd never seen before. She folded the photo back up before her hands could shake too hard, her mind reeling. She was about to reach for the letter when a voice cracked the silent air. "You shouldn't be touching things that ain't yours." Charlotte jumped, spinning around. Whit hadn't moved an inch, but his eyes were wide open, watching her from the floor. They weren't angry. They were just tired. She said nothing, clutching the photograph in her fist. He rose slowly, a man carrying the weight of years on his shoulders. He stood across from her, his voice never rising above a low murmur. "I suppose you think I owe you an explanation." Charlotte's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. "She thought you were dead," she whispered, her voice cracking. Whit's eyes didn't change, but something behind them flickered with an ancient pain. She wasn't wrong. The man she married died in Virginia, the one who came back. He wasn't fit for anything, not for her, not for them. Charlotte stared at him, her mind trying to piece it all together. Her father, this stranger, this quiet, dangerous man, was her father. "You left," she accused, her voice growing stronger. "And now you want us to believe you came back out of kindness?" "I came back," he said, his voice level and hard, "because I heard what happened, and because nobody else was going to stop what was coming." "What's coming?" That's when Whit finally looked away. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark, whispering trees. "Men," he said, his voice low and grim. "Ones who think those kids are worth more as labor than as family. I put in the bid to save you, yes, but someone else had already marked you for their own. You think that auction was the end of it? Charlotte, that was just the beginning. They're coming to collect." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I was hoping to outrun it." A sound came from the stairs, a floorboard creaking. It was Mason. "I remember you," he said. Both Charlotte and Whit turned. Mason stepped down into the room barefoot, his young face unreadable. "You came once, a long time ago. You gave Ma a letter. She read it, and then she threw it in the fire." Whit nodded slowly, the confirmation of another old failure. "I know." "Were you lying then too?" Mason asked, his voice sharp with a child's unwavering sense of justice. "No." Mason didn't move. "Do you know who wants us?" Whit took a deep breath, like the name itself pained him. "His name is Stanton Riggs. He owns land east of the river, not the kind that grows crops. He buys people, smuggles them out past the border. Kids, mostly. He disguises it all as charity, but it's not. The town knows. Some of them get paid to look the other way." Charlotte's blood ran cold. Did she know?" she whispered. Whit's jaw tightened into a hard line. "She knew enough to hide. That's why she kept you all out in the hills, away from the main trade roads. That's why she changed your names. I found out what Riggs was planning too late." Silence followed, thick and heavy with unspoken history. It wasn't until hours later, well past 3 in the morning, that Charlotte finally asked the question she'd been holding back since Greer's Crossing. "What's in the locket?" Whit turned the small gold object over in his palm. He opened it. "Hair," he said softly. "From my first daughter. She died before you were born." Charlotte stared at him, the pieces finally clicking into a heartbreaking picture. "So, we're your second family." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the crushing silence that followed, the wind stirred the trees outside. A faint creak of a branch made Charlotte stiffen. She moved to the window, pulled the rough curtain back just a sliver, and her heart stopped. A lantern, half covered, flickered in the dark between the trees. Then another. Then a third. They weren't alone. Whit moved fast, silent as a breath, already reaching for his rifle. "Wake the others," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now." Charlotte didn't argue. She didn't have time. By the time she had Mason shaking June awake and whispering urgently to Eli and Samuel, the cabin had transformed. It was no longer a resting place in the middle of nowhere. It had become a box, a trap. Every creaking wall, every draft between the floorboards, felt like a pair of watching eyes. The children stirred in silence, a grim testament to the life they'd been living. They had been trained by months of running and fear not to ask questions they couldn't afford the answers to. June's small hand found Charlotte's coat sleeve and locked onto the fabric with a grip that said she understood everything without needing a single word. Outside, the third lantern blinked out. Total darkness. Whit stood at the door, his rifle already shouldered. He wasn't aiming. He was just waiting. "They're watching," he said, his voice low and tight. "They want to see if anyone runs. If we bolt now, they'll chase us down in the open. If we stay, they'll surround us and wait us out." "Then what do we do?" Charlotte asked, clutching June so close she could feel the little girl's heart beating against her own. "We let them come," Whit said, his eyes glinting in the firelight, "but we do it on our terms." Mason looked up from the corner, his face pale but his eyes defiant. "That sounds like a good way to get shot." Whit didn't even blink. "Not if I shoot first." He was terrifyingly calm. That was the strangest part. He didn't speak like a rancher or a farmer trying to protect a few kids he'd taken pity on. He spoke like a man who had done this before. He spoke like someone who had already buried bodies for less. Charlotte didn't know what ghosts haunted him, but it wasn't just abandonment. It wasn't just guilt. There was a history in that stare, a terrible depth, like he'd stared too long into the eyes of something unforgivable and had seen it stare right back. He didn't say another word. He turned to the fire and kicked it apart, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the dirty windows. Then he moved to the beds and began untying old storage ropes from underneath the frames. "We buy time," he said simply, starting to barricade the door with the heavy wooden furniture. "Then we move." Charlotte followed his orders without asking questions. She helped. Mason, his fear replaced by a cold fury, stacked chairs and overturned the table, checking every window latch as if it might hold back a god. Eli and Samuel, wordless and eerily efficient, did everything she told them without protest. June cried out once when the wind made the shutters thud against the wall, but Charlotte pressed the little girl's face against her chest and whispered, "You're not alone," over and over, until the trembling stopped. Then the first knock came. It wasn't soft. It was loud, measured, as if someone was counting the seconds between each heavy pound on the door. Whit stood perfectly still, the rifle steady in his hands, his eyes fixed on the wood. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The knock came again. Then a voice, cold and muffled, but loud enough to scrape against every wall in the small cabin. "You've got something that ain't yours in there, Garner." Whit didn't answer. Charlotte's chest tightened until it hurt. She felt June's small fingers curl into the collar of her shirt. Mason picked up the heavy iron poker from beside the hearth. He held it like a sword, even though it trembled in his hand. The voice continued, closer now. You knew the rules. You knew the bid at the auction was just a formality, a public show. You made your point. Now give him over before this gets messy. Give him over? Charlotte whispered to Whit. Who is he talking about? Stanton Riggs's man, Whit said without looking at her. Probably a man named Callum. He used to break horses. Then he found out he was better at breaking people. The door rattled slightly. A metallic clang hit the latch, then silence. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching slowly away from the door. They're circling to the back, Whit said, his senses preternaturally sharp. They'll wait until we're tired or stupid. If we're not out of here by dawn, they'll set the place on fire. Samuel, the quietest of them all, finally spoke. His voice was small, but it carried a chilling weight. We've been in fires before. Charlotte turned, surprised. Samuel's eyes didn't move from the door. Back at the mine, he said, his voice flat. After they took us the first time. They burned the bunkhouse to make us stay out in the cold. Then they blamed us for it. Eli nodded beside him, his face grim. They did worse than that. I know, Whit said, and his voice was so full of pain that Charlotte's throat tightened. Another knock, harder this time. Then a window shattered, glass scattered across the floor like ice. Mason screamed, June wailed, Whit fired once. The blast from the rifle echoed through the cabin like thunder cracking right overhead. Dead silence followed. Then the voice came again, further off this time, angrier. Bad mistake, Whit. A very bad mistake. Whit didn't wait for orders. He pointed to a small trap door in the corner of the room. The root cellar! Get them in there! Now! Charlotte pulled June under the heavy wooden door into the cold, damp dark. She shoved the other children in after her. Stay down. Stay quiet. Don't you dare come up until I come and get you. Mason didn't want to go. He grabbed her wrist, his eyes wide with terror. He's going to die up here. Charlotte gripped his face, forcing him to look at her. Not if we help him by staying out of his way. Now go! Whit was already at another part of the floor, pulling up a loose plank. We've got 5 minutes, maybe less, before they start lighting torches. He revealed a crawl space. It was dusty, dark, and narrow enough to scrape their elbows raw. There's a tunnel, an old smuggler's path. It leads down to the river. It's about a mile walk underground and it's tight, but it comes up near my wagon. I parked it off the road. There are supplies, tools, enough to get us moving again. You said you were hoping to outrun this, Charlotte said, staring at him. But you came here ready for a fight. He didn't deny it. I knew they'd come for you eventually. She stared at him, a sudden horrible thought dawning on her. Then why didn't you just leave us in the town? Why bring us all the way out here? His voice cracked, just for a second. Because this is where they'd least expect you to be able to fight back. Before she could process what that meant, he was pushing her toward the crawl space. Get the others in. Keep moving. Don't stop. June whimpered, but didn't cry. Eli held Samuel's hand so tight their knuckles turned white. Mason crawled first, never once looking back. Charlotte was the last to enter. Whit passed her a lantern with a low flame, hidden inside a metal hood. He didn't follow her in. You're not coming, she said, her stomach dropping. I have to slow them down, he said. That's suicide. No, he said, his eyes meeting hers one last time in the dim light. That's penance. He shut the panel above her head before she could argue, plunging them into darkness. The crawl space felt like a tomb. The air was thick and old, smelling of damp earth and decay. The walls pressed in on them, so tight around their shoulders they could barely move. They crawled for what felt like hours, an eternity in the dark. Charlotte kept count of every twist, every dip in the tunnel, until her knees were raw and her throat burned from holding back her own fear. At one point, deep in the suffocating blackness, June whispered, "Will he find us again?" "Yes," Charlotte said, forcing a confidence she didn't feel into her voice. But in her heart, she didn't believe it. No one could survive what they'd left behind. When they finally emerged, pushing a heavy stone out of a hillside. Dawn was already breaking. The light bled over the horizon like a fresh wound. The wagon was right where Whit had said it would be, covered and ready, hidden in a thicket of pine trees. There was even water and jerky packed neatly in the back. Mason climbed up to the front seat and scanned the ridge they'd just escaped from. His face was grim. "He's not coming," he said flatly. "He will," Charlotte whispered, more to herself than to him. They waited. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The woods were silent, except for the birds, who didn't know or care about the violence that had happened just over the hill. It wasn't until the sun was at its full height that the first rider came. But it wasn't Whit. It was one of Riggs's men, his face bloodied, his coat torn. He didn't see them. He just rode past, looking half dead, heading east as fast as his horse could carry him. Then another came, then 3 more, all of them beaten, all of them fleeing. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She stood up, her hands trembling, and watched the direction they had come from. A column of thick black smoke was rising from where the cabin had been, and then, at last, a figure emerged from that smoke. He was limping badly, his coat was torn to shreds, and a trail of blood followed him down his left leg. It was Whit Garner. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like something that had barely survived its own judgment day. But he was alive. He reached the wagon and collapsed against its edge, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He said only one thing: "They'll regroup." Charlotte helped him inside, bandaging his leg as best she could with strips torn from a blanket. Then she climbed up beside Mason, grabbed the reins, and snapped them hard. The wagon rolled forward, away from the burning past. Behind them, a pillar of smoke marked the grave of the cabin and the ghosts Whit had left there. But ahead, the road forked, and none of them knew which path would lead to safety and which would lead to something far, far worse. The river ran beside them like a nervous vein, a silver ribbon always moving faster than they could, always pulling towards something they couldn't see. Whit lay half-conscious in the back of the wagon, the crude bandage on his leg already soaked through with blood. His breathing was shallow, but it was steady, which comforted Charlotte only slightly. She knew enough about the world to recognize the weight of a man who had pushed himself far past the edge of what was survivable. They were headed northwest now, following a scrolled map Whit had tucked into the lining of the wagon seat. It wasn't a proper map with roads and towns. It was just suggestions scrawled in ink. Cut through where pines thin. Watch for creek near Split Stone. Don't stop until Black Ridge. Charlotte steered the wagon while Mason kept lookout, his young eyes squinting through the trees as if he expected death to leap out from behind every trunk. The other children slept in fits and starts, waking each time the wheels hit a deep rut or a jolt made June cry out in her sleep. No one spoke about what had happened at the cabin. No one dared. 2 nights passed like that, tense and exhausted, wrapped in a blanket of suffocating quiet. On the 3rd day, the wind shifted, and Whit finally stirred enough to speak. "They won't follow us too far," he murmured, his voice hoarse, his face gray with pain. "They got paid to scare, not to chase across 3 counties. Charlotte sat beside him, ladling some broth from a tin can she was warming over a small, smokeless fire. "They nearly killed you." "Still breathing, ain't I?" he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You lit the place on fire yourself, didn't you?" she asked, her eyes fixed on his. Whit turned his head away, looking out at the trees. "They were going to do it anyway," he admitted. "I just made sure there wasn't anything left for them to use." Charlotte didn't press him. She could see the truth flickering in his exhausted eyes. It wasn't just about survival. It was about ending something. That cabin hadn't just been a safe house. It had been a tomb for his old sins, and Whit had decided to burn them all to the ground. As dawn broke over the 4th morning, a buzz of noise reached them before they saw anything else. Laughter, horses, the clang of metal on wood. It was a small town, if you could even call it that. Just 5 ramshackle buildings and a leaning church pressed into the crook of a deep canyon. Whit winced as he sat up, gripping the side of the wagon. "We'll rest here," he said, "just for a day." "But what if they look for us here?" Charlotte whispered. "They won't," he interrupted, his voice firm. "This place isn't on any road, not even the law comes through here." That should have comforted her. It didn't. The town was called Mercy Gulch, a name far too hopeful for how it looked. The saloon was the largest building, its sign sun-faded and missing the Y. A handful of locals watched from shadowed porches as the wagon rolled in. None of them looked eager to greet strangers. Charlotte carried June on her hip and kept her free hand resting on the handle of the knife Whit had given her. She hoped she wouldn't have to use it. They found a room for rent above the general store. It was bare and dusty, but it had beds. It would have to do. By nightfall, Whit was burning with fever. His skin was hot to the touch. Charlotte sat beside him, soaking a cloth in cool water and placing it on his forehead, trying to keep him conscious. He would drift, mumbling about fire and smoke, then go silent again. Just then, Mason burst into the room, a boyish urgency in his step. "There's a preacher downstairs," he said breathlessly. "He says he knows you." Whit groaned. "Tell him to go to hell." But Charlotte was already on the stairs. The preacher was an older man, clad in black, with weary eyes that looked like they hadn't smiled in years. "I heard a man named Whit Garner limped into my town today," he said, sipping from a chipped tin cup. "That man owes me a prayer, and a debt." "What kind of debt?" Charlotte asked, her hand still near her knife. The preacher looked at her, his expression not kind, but something deeper, understanding. "The kind a man tries to pay back with his own blood when he can't find the words." He paused. He handed her a small, dark vial. "Boil this in clean water. It'll bring the fever down." Charlotte hesitated. "He saved my brother's boy once," the preacher explained. "Ran him across 6 counties to avoid a hanging he didn't deserve. Said nothing. Took a bullet doing it. Never even asked for thanks." Charlotte didn't ask how the preacher had come by the medicine. She just took it and ran back upstairs. Whit's fever broke by morning. They left Mercy Gulch before the sun had risen fully, taking a western pass that Whit swore would lead them to a high, hidden ridge. Beyond that ridge, he said, was an abandoned mission. It was once a stop for trade routes that had long since dried up. Now it was just a shell with 4 stone walls and a well deep enough to provide clear, cold water. That was where he wanted to go. "No one left to claim it," he'd said. "No one to stop us from making it our own." The children were quiet that day, more so than usual. Even June just stared blankly ahead as the wagon rocked and swayed. As dusk began to settle, Samuel finally spoke. "Are we still orphans?" he asked, his small voice barely a whisper. Charlotte looked down at him, the question hitting her harder than any bullet could have. "What do you mean?" "We're not in the house anymore," he reasoned with a child's simple logic. "We're not being split up. And Mr. Whit, he didn't leave us." "I don't know," she answered honestly, her throat tight. From the front of the wagon, Whit turned his head slightly. "You're something else now," he said. "What?" Mason asked from the driver's seat. Whit didn't elaborate. They reached the ridge just after sundown. When Charlotte saw the land beyond it, she gasped. It was a broad, hidden stretch of meadow, tucked so far away from the roads and rivers that it might as well have been forgotten by time itself. The mission was there, half crumbled but still standing proud against the sky. The bell tower was gone, but its stone base still held strong. When Charlotte climbed the steps, she could see for miles in every direction. No riders, no smoke, no shadows moving where they shouldn't be. They stayed there for weeks. It felt like they had found the one safe place left in the world. Mason learned how to build a fence from scratch. Eli carved a slingshot and taught Samuel how to hunt rabbits. June started to smile more, her laughter echoing off the old stone walls. Even Whit, who still limped, began to carry tools instead of rifles. He planted herbs near the well. He cut timber for shelter. He even laughed once, a real, genuine laugh, when Samuel tried to ride a wild goat that had wandered in from the woods. Charlotte should have felt peace. But peace, she was learning, never felt permanent. It always felt like the quiet breath before the storm. One night, when the wind howled harder than it had in weeks, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, standing alone. She wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Her hair was silver and flowed down her back, though her face was no older than 40. She just stood there, unmoving, watching them. Charlotte rose slowly, her hand going to her side. Whit came up silently behind her. "I know her," he said, his voice low. "Is she dangerous?" "She's worse than dangerous," he replied. "She's a messenger." He stepped forward into the open. The woman finally called out, her voice carrying on the wind. "Whit Garner! Those children you stole! Are they worth what's coming for you?" Whit didn't reply. She walked closer, her steps slow and deliberate. "Stanton Riggs has put gold on your name," she said, her eyes cold. "Not paper money. Real gold. That's how badly he wants them back." Charlotte stepped up to stand beside Whit. "He's not getting them." The woman's smile was a cruel slash that didn't reach her eyes. "Then he'll take you instead." She dropped a small, cloth-wrapped parcel at her feet, turned, and walked back into the woods, disappearing as silently as she had arrived. Inside the package was a drawing, a sketch. Charlotte recognized it immediately. It was June, Samuel, Eli, and Mason. The sketches were lifelike, detailed, and dated. They were signed by someone named D. Mayer. The bounty wasn't just for Whit, it was for the children. Each of them had a price, and the highest price of all wasn't on June, the youngest. It wasn't even on Whit, the man who had defied them. It was on Mason. Whit sat down hard on a nearby bench, the blood draining from his face. "What did you do?" Charlotte whispered, turning to him, her heart pounding. Whit didn't answer, but Mason did. "I know why," he said, his voice quiet, steady, and terrifyingly calm. His eyes were wide with a terrible, newfound understanding. "They're not after us because of what we are," he said, his gaze meeting Charlotte's. "They're after us because of who I am." The fire cracked between them, the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone silent. It turned Mason's shadow into a long, wavering giant against the broken mission wall. June whimpered in her sleep, and Samuel turned over, still lost in some innocent dream. But Charlotte, Whit, and Mason stayed frozen, caught in the gravity of the boy's words. That name from the sketch, D. Mayer, still echoed in Charlotte's head. The bounty wasn't just about escaped labor. It was personal. It was focused. And it was centered on her twin brother. He knew something. He remembered something. Whit was too stunned to speak, so Charlotte turned to Mason. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "Start from the beginning." Mason's voice was thin, but it didn't tremble. "I used to live somewhere else, before the fire, before Ma said we had to hide. It was a white house with black shutters. It had a big porch swing." He paused, his eyes looking at something far away. "My ma, she smelled like lilacs and fresh bread. My PA, I don't remember his face right. But I remember the sound of his boots on the porch. They had spurs that jingled, soft-like, not loud, gentle." He stopped, his throat catching. "Go on," Charlotte urged. "I wasn't always at the orphan house with you all," Mason confessed, the words spilling out of him now. "One day I just wasn't at the White House anymore. I was somewhere else. There were men in dark coats, and a man with gloves. He told me I was a mistake that couldn't be undone. I didn't know what it meant, but he signed a paper, and I never saw my house or my real ma again." "Do you remember his name?" Whit asked, his voice a low growl. Mason nodded slowly. "Mayer. He wore a ring, the same black stone ring as the gloved man who was watching at the auction. I never forgot that ring." Whit stood up slowly, his legs stiff, his mind racing. "D. Mayer. Dathan Mayer. He's not a bounty hunter. He's a registrar. He keeps records for powerful families like the Riggs clan. He keeps the undesirables separated from their bloodlines. Charlotte frowned, confused. What does that mean? Whit looked at her, his jaw tight with fury. It means Mason is somebody's son. Somebody rich enough, somebody powerful enough, that they didn't want the world to know he ever existed. He's Stanton Riggs's bastard son. And now that word has gotten out that he's alive, they want him silenced, quietly, permanently. Mason didn't react. He just nodded, as if he'd suspected a truth this terrible all along. Charlotte finally took a breath. If they want him that bad, they'll burn down mountains to get to him, Whit finished grimly. They packed at first light. The mission was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target. Charlotte carried June and led the younger children down the rocky slope, while Whit staggered behind them, trying not to show how much pain his leg was still in. They had nowhere left to run, not unless they figured out a way to make a ghost disappear for good. Whit had a desperate idea, a woman he knew from his past. Her name's Temperance Holloway, he said, leaning on Charlotte for support as they walked. She used to forge papers, fake death records, identity transfers, that sort of thing. If anyone can hide a boy like Mason, it's her. Their journey took them into a high canyon, carved by wind and lightning. Snow still clung to the shadows, a late spring that hadn't reached this far into the mountains yet. As they made camp, Mason sat apart from the others, staring blankly into the fire. Charlotte joined him, handing him a strip of dried meat. He took it, but didn't eat. Are you mad I didn't say anything sooner? He asked quietly. She shook her head. You didn't know what it all meant. I had dreams, he whispered. The porch swing, the lilacs. I thought I just made it all up. You didn't, she said softly. He finally looked up at her, his eyes wet with unshed tears. Why would someone want to forget they had a son? She didn't have an answer for him. She didn't know how to explain a world that cruel. The next day brought a wind sharp enough to cut skin. They reached the edge of a deep canyon just before dusk. A rickety bridge, half broken but still passable, stretched across the chasm. Beyond it, a slanting shack was built right into the stone wall, with a thin trail of smoke trailing from its chimney. Temperance Holloway answered the door with a shotgun leveled at Whit's chest. Whit Garner, she said, her voice like gravel. I was hoping you'd died. Not yet, he replied, his breath fogging in the cold air. I need your help. Her sharp gaze moved from Whit to Charlotte, then to Mason, and finally to the other children bundled up behind them. You brought orphans? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Not exactly, Whit said. She stared at them for a long moment, then lowered the shotgun and stepped aside. Get in, she grumbled, before you bring the whole damn world down on my head. Temperance's home was a chaotic mess of maps, ledgers, old newspaper clippings, and ink pots. She wore thick leather gloves even indoors, and carried herself like a woman who was used to being betrayed. Charlotte explained everything. The auction, the cabin, the mission, the bounty sketch dropped in the dirt. Temperance studied the drawing of the children. This was done by Eliza Storrow, she said, her voice low. She only draws children if they're worth more than 5 figures to someone. Riggs didn't just put a price on these kids, he's cataloging them. Why? Charlotte asked. Because some of them don't belong on his books, but he wants them buried like they do, Temperance explained, her eyes flicking to Mason. The girl, June, she's too young to be a threat. But this boy, he's different. The Riggs family has a bastard son they tried to get rid of. They thought they had. And if he grows up and someone finds out who he really is, the rightful heirs could lose everything. Temperance pulled out a sheet of thick, yellowed paper. I can make him disappear. Not just hide him. I can make him officially dead on every record from here to the coast. But it'll take a few days. I need things. Fingerprints, hair samples, and I need him to trust me. Mason nodded solemnly. What do I need to do? Stay right here, she said. Don't leave this house. And don't you dare open that door for anyone. She decided to keep Mason and Samuel with her while the rest of them rode for supplies. The children needed food, warmer blankets, and more horses if they were going to keep moving north. They rode into a place called Dry Hook, barely a town, more of a dusty crossing point for desperate men. But trouble was already waiting for them. A poster was slapped onto the telegraph pole. It was a new bounty, and it had Charlotte's face on it, and Whit's, and Mason's, wanted. Not dead, not alive, just returned. The reward had doubled, and worse, a group of men in long gray coats lingered by the saloon. One of them turned, and in the fading light, Charlotte saw it. A glint of black on his finger, the stone ring. Mayor's man. They turned their horses and rode out of town immediately, their hearts pounding. Back at Temperance's shack, everything was too quiet. A chilling silence had fallen over the canyon. Charlotte's stomach dropped the moment she stepped inside. No one answered her call. "Mason!" she shouted. "Samuel!" No reply. Whit drew his gun. Temperance's cluttered desk was overturned, papers scattered everywhere. A dark smear of blood stained the wood floor. It was a handprint, and it was too small to be an adult's. Charlotte ran to the back room. It was empty. The boys were gone. A single, chilling word was carved into the wooden doorframe. Mine. They came at dusk. 3 riders on black horses, their faces cold and expressionless. One of them held Samuel by the arm, the boy's face pale with terror. The second had Temperance, gagged and bound. The third rider dismounted slowly. It was Dathan Mayer himself. He stepped down from his saddle and stared at Whit, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his face. "You should have stayed dead, Garner," he said, his voice smooth as poison. Whit didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Samuel. Mayer continued, enjoying the moment. "The boy is going to a special place, a place where he'll be educated, controlled, and eventually forgotten, just like his mother, just like the last dozen bastards who threatened the purity of the Riggs bloodline." Charlotte stepped in front of Whit, her body trembling with rage. "He's just a child!" Mayer smiled, a chilling, empty gesture. "All the more reason to correct the mistake early." Whit took a step forward. "You'll have to kill me first." Mayer nodded slowly. "I intend to." But the first shot didn't come from Whit's gun. It didn't come from Mayer's men. It cracked from the trees to the east, a sharp report that split the silence and sent Mayer's horse screaming into the canyon wind. The bullet tore through the shoulder of the man holding Temperance, spinning him sideways. She didn't hesitate for a second. She dropped and rolled, ripping the gag from her mouth with bloodied fingers and scrambling for cover behind a shelf of rock. The man holding Samuel tightened his grip, trying to drag the boy toward his mount, but Charlotte moved faster than she ever had in her life. She threw herself forward, a desperate flying tackle, catching Samuel by the waist and pulling him so hard they both tumbled into the dirt. Mason was still gone, but she had Samuel. Whit opened fire. His first shot hit the third rider in the thigh. His second went wide, ricocheting off a post with a loud ping. Mayer didn't even flinch. He moved like a man who had never been hit, who didn't believe it was even possible. He drew his own pistol slowly, precisely, as if the whole messy affair bored him. But this time, things weren't going his way. More gunfire snapped from the trees. Temperance's people, old contacts, debts she hadn't forgotten, coming to her aid. It wasn't an army, but it was enough to confuse the lines. The gray-coated men scattered, losing their advantage as Charlotte dragged Samuel behind a woodpile, and Temperance reloaded her rifle with mechanical calm. Whit advanced slowly, using the slope of the canyon for cover, his limp barely noticeable in the heat of the fight. Mayer ducked behind a barrel, his cold eyes scanning the chaos. "Whit, Garner," he called out, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "You're not the type to gamble. You don't play unless you know the odds." Whit didn't answer. He was saving his breath, saving his bullets. "I wonder then," Mayer went on, "how you possibly thought this would end. You, limping from a gunshot wound. No army, no backing. Protecting children who don't even bear your name." A new shot rang out. closer this time. Samuel covered his ears and whimpered. "Give me the boy!" Mayor's voice dropped lower, a venomous hiss. "Just give me the boy and I'll forget the rest ever happened." Temperance's rifle clacked behind them. "Man talks too much," she muttered. Just then, Temperance gestured toward a ravine to the south. "There's a tunnel," she whispered urgently. "An old mining route. I've used it before. It'll take you to the next valley over. But someone has to draw their fire here, and someone has to find Mason." That name, Mason, hit the air like a whip crack. "They've taken him," Whit said, his face grim. "They're heading east, to the train depot." Temperance nodded. "Stanton Riggs owns that rail line. No manifest checks. They can sneak him right past the border into Greywood territory. He'll be gone for good." Charlotte didn't hesitate. "Then we go now." But Whit held her arm, stopping her. "No, you go." Her brow furrowed. "What?" "You and Temperance," he said, his eyes pleading with her. "Take the children. Go through the tunnel. I'll buy you the time you need." She shook her head hard, her hair flying. "No, we are not leaving you behind." "You have to," he insisted, his voice cracking. "They'll always track us if I'm with you. I'm the one with the bounty on my head. I'm the name. I'm the trail. You need to disappear." "Whit." He leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers for a fraction of a second. A silent goodbye. "You saved them, Charlotte. All of them. Now let me do the same." Temperance pulled Charlotte gently back. "He's right. We can't wait." Whit pressed his heavy revolver into Charlotte's hand. "Keep it close." She hesitated for one last agonizing second. Then she turned, called for Samuel, and followed Temperance down into the canyon's southern mouth, where thick brush covered a narrow trail that led down into the earth. Whit watched until the shadows swallowed them completely. Then he stood up, and he walked toward Dathan Mayer. He was alone. He kept his hands loose and empty at his sides, his back straight. Mayer raised a curious eyebrow. "Coming to your senses, Garner?" Whit stopped 10 paces away. "You think this is about sense?" Mayer laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Everything is. Even chaos follows a plan. I knew a man like you would never just run." "Where is the boy?" Whit asked, his voice flat. Mayer smiled coldly. "Already gone. Riggs has him by now. By this time tomorrow he won't even remember your name." Whit nodded slowly. Then he lunged. Not for Mayer. For the barrel of lantern oil standing behind him. A single match sparked from his coat. It hit the ground and flared. The blast roared up like a dragon's throat, a wall of fire tearing sideways as the oil ignited. Smoke billowed out, thick and black, swallowing the light, swallowing the sound, swallowing everything. Whit fell back, coughing, shielding his eyes. He had done what he came for. He had created a diversion. He had bought them time. He ran north, dodging between brush and stone, drawing every last rider away from his family, leading them on a chase into the burning chaos he had made. Charlotte and the others reached the other side of the mountain just as night fell. The air was colder here, sharper. June shivered in her arms. Samuel limped slightly, but kept pace without a single complaint. The children didn't cry, not even when they looked back and saw the orange glow of the fire burning in the sky, far behind them. Temperance led them to a hunting cabin she swore was abandoned. Inside was dust, a single cot, and a half-finished deck of cards left in the corner. Charlotte laid the children down, brushing the hair from June's forehead, whispering lullabies that didn't feel like lies, even though everything else in their world did. They waited through the long, dark night. No word from Whit. No sign of Mason. When morning came, Temperance laid out a map on the dusty floor. "If they're taking him to Greywood," she said, her voice grim, "we still have one shot." Charlotte leaned over it. "Where?" "There's only one train that runs south from here. It leaves from Belcross Station. Midnight tomorrow. That's their only exit point. It has to be." Charlotte stared at the small black dot on the map. "I'll go alone," she said. Temperance didn't argue. Samuel, who had been listening silently, stepped forward, clutching something in his small hand. He held it out to her. It was Whit's revolver. "I think you should have this," he whispered. Charlotte took the heavy gun. The decision was made. She rode out at dusk, her coat tied tight against the wind, Whit's revolver strapped at her side. The wind howled low through the gulches as she rode, the miles turning into a blur of rock and shadow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the minutes. Belcross Station wasn't a town. It was just tracks, a small station house, and a whole lot of silence. She watched from a cliff overlooking the tracks as the train rolled in, its engine hissing steam into the cold night air. And then she saw him. A small figure was being led onto the platform by two tall men. One had a rifle slung over his back. The other carried a set of iron shackles. It was Mason. He walked like he'd been drugged, his eyes unfocused, his steps soft and uncertain. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She pulled her coat tighter and began to make her way down the ridge, moving silently through the brush, toward the platform, toward the guards, toward the brother who had no idea that someone was coming for him. She didn't breathe as she moved, just one step after the other, the wind at her back, pulling her down that ridge as if the land itself wanted her to make it in time. The last train to Graywood roared in, a slow freight with passenger cars tacked on the end. The curtains on the cars were drawn too tight for comfort. And there, between the third and fourth car, the two men held Mason, his face barely visible under the brim of a hat that was far too large for him. He was smaller than she remembered, slower. His walk was a drugged, pathetic stagger. Charlotte counted the steps, the yards, the heartbeats. She reached the thick brush at the edge of the platform just as one of the men checked a pocket watch and gestured to the second. They lifted Mason like he was a sack of cargo. No tenderness, no words. She stepped out of the shadows. "Put him down," she said, her voice clear and steady. The gun in her hand felt like an extension of her own will. Both men froze. One of them instinctively reached for his sidearm, but Charlotte fired low, the bullet splintering the wooden plank at his feet. The echo cracked across the tracks like a whip, spooking the nearby horses. The man jumped back, swearing under his breath. At the sound, Mason stirred, his head lifting slightly. The second man narrowed his eyes. "You're not getting him, girl." "He's not yours to have." Charlotte's voice didn't shake. "Neither is he yours," the first one spat. "You think blood counts for more than a contract? We've got a signature. We've got coin. We've got every legal mark we need. You've got poison in your veins and wax in your ears if you think I care about your papers." A tense pause. Then footsteps from behind her. More men. She pivoted fast. 5 others stepped out from behind the station house. They were uniformed, quiet, armed. It wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. She didn't back down. She shifted sideways until her back was against a stack of cargo crates. One arm pressed against the cool wood, the other holding Whit's revolver high. She could feel the pulse in her wrist, heavy and steady, the kind of beat a heart takes on when it's already made up its mind. "Back away," one of the new men said. "You're outnumbered." "And you're out of time," she replied, nodding her head toward the ridgeline behind them. Because something else was moving up there. Dust rose where hooves kicked up gravel. One figure, then two, then three. It was Whit, bleeding, limping, but alive. Temperance was beside him. Behind them was a cart, drawn fast and hard by Charlotte's own stolen mule. And on that cart was a crate with Stanton Riggs's own family seal, broken wide open, showing nothing inside but straw and a pile of forged manifests. Temperance stood tall on the buckboard and held something high in the air. An iron seal, a perfect copy of the Riggs family crest. "Is this enough paper for you bastards?" she yelled, her voice echoing across the station. The uniformed men turned, just for a second, distracted by this new, impossible development. Charlotte used that second. She fired again, clean this time. The bullet knocked the revolver from the hand of the nearest guard. Mason stumbled forward, and Charlotte caught him mid-step. He collapsed into her arms, a sudden familiar weight. "It's me," she whispered, and his eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, dazed. Temperance pulled hard on the reins, sending the cart into a hard arc that blocked the line of fire from the west. Whit ducked low, returning fire with a shotgun he'd pulled from beneath his coat. The blast cracked open the silence. The guards dove for cover. Charlotte ran. She ran with Mason in her arms, not toward the train, but away from it, toward the tree line, toward the gully that ran behind the station, where Temperance's map had shown a trail forgotten by everyone else. Behind her, the firefight blurred into a chaos of screaming voices and the sharp bite of gunpowder. She didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. By the time she reached the gully, Whit was already there, leaning against a rock, his shoulder bleeding again, his face streaked with smoke. But he held out a hand and helped her down the steep slope. "Is he all right?" he gasped. Mason's eyes were open now, more alert. "He will be," she said. Temperance followed, breathless, with blood on her coat that didn't seem to be her own. They crouched in the gully's crook, hidden from the station above. Whit checked the revolver, 2 rounds left. "They'll send more," Charlotte exhaled. "I know." "Then we keep moving," Whit said. He looked at Mason. "Can you walk?" The boy nodded, so they walked. Hours passed in silence. They didn't talk. They didn't plan. They just moved. They made it to a new safe house by dawn, a place Temperance knew, some widow's cellar in a town too small to even be listed on maps. It smelled of pickled eggs and old tobacco, but it was safe. For now. The children slept in a corner, huddled together in a pile of blankets. Charlotte watched them from the far wall, her knees tucked to her chest. Whit came and sat beside her. His shirt was torn and bloodied. He'd taken a knife wound in the last stretch, shallow but angry. "How long before they track us here?" she asked. "Not long," he admitted. She nodded. "And what then?" Whit stared into the dark cellar. "Then we leave the map," he said. She turned to him. "What?" "We don't run anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We vanish. No more trails, no more towns, just sky and dirt and each other." Charlotte let the thought settle in her chest. "You think we can do that?" Whit almost smiled. "I think we already are." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, she felt the crushing weight of the last few weeks begin to lift. Outside, the wind howled softly against the cellar walls. Not cruelly, not like before, but more like a lullaby. And inside, in the warm, safe dark, June stirred in her sleep, whispering a name that wasn't hers and wouldn't be again for a long, long time. They didn't stay long. 3 days. Just enough to rest, just enough to hear through Temperance's network of contacts that Stanton Riggs had pulled his men back. He was too embarrassed to report the loss, too rich to care about real justice, and too proud to ever admit that he had failed. In the end, there were no heroes. There were no villains caught. There were just people who refused to quit. They moved west after that. New names, new towns, new silences. Charlotte never forgot the sound of Mason's voice when he said her name, like he really meant it. Or the way June had clung to her the night the cellar had gone dark. Or the way Samuel had carved a tiny wooden bird and left it by Whit's side while he was passed out from blood loss. No one would ever write songs about them. No one would ever know their story. But they lived. And in a world like that, sometimes living was the most anyone could ever ask for. 5 years later, a stranger rode into a remote town where no one asked any questions. He carried a small child on one hip and had a faint scar just beneath his eye. His name didn't match any wanted posters anymore, but the look in his eyes still held the same fire. He asked for bread, paid in gold, and left a quiet message with the woman behind the counter. "Tell them we're still free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival and justice from the forgotten corners of history."